we entered an age of biological control. That's the first thing I'm going to try and introduce in my talk. And you'll see the structure of the talk here in red on the slide. I'm going to first talk about control. I'm then going to talk about bodies. I'm then going to talk about souls. And I'm then going to talk about somatic ethics in an age of biological control. And just to introduce some people who may be figured in this talk, this person here, that's Ian Wilmot, the cloner of Dolly the sheep. This person here, that's Schmidt, F.O. Schmidt, the inventor of the term neuroscience. This person here is Henry Markram, the leader of the Human Brain Project that aims to create a simulation of the human brain, molecule by molecule, neuron by neuron, in a supercomputer. This person here is Craig Venter, the first person, in his view, to have created life, or rather the second person to have created life. The first person, as we know, is probably present. And this person here is Yang Huaming, Henry Yang, who is the founder of the Beijing Genomics Institute. Yang Huaming argues that we know the secret of life, and it's 42. It's the 4 base pairs, C, A, G, and T, the 4 base pairs of DNA, and it's the zeros and ones of information science. So as the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy told us a long time ago, the answer to the meaning of life, according to Yang Huaming, is indeed 42. Oh, yes, and this person here, some of you may recognize, is Gilles Deleuze. Control, then. Talking of Gilles Deleuze, some of you may have come across Gilles Deleuze's little piece called Postscript to Societies of Control, written in a characteristically Deleuzean style, rather free from evidence and full of profound speculation. But nonetheless, I think there are some things in this piece written maybe 25 years ago now that are quite instructive. This is what Deleuze says: "We are in a generalized crisis in relation to all the environments of enclosure, prison, hospital, factory, school, family. Everyone knows these institutions are finished. It's only a matter of administering their last rites and of keeping people employed until the installation of the new forces knocking at the door." Well, actually, if I may say so, at least some of those, at least the prison, is not quite finished, but there you go. These are, Deleuze says, societies of control, which are in the process of replacing disciplinary societies. Control is the term for the new ultra-rapid forms of free-floating control that replace the old disciplines operating in the time frame of a closed system. There's no need to invoke the extraordinary pharmaceutical productions, molecular engineering, genetic manipulations, although these are slated to enter the new processes. And Deleuze concludes with this, I think, rather profound thought. It is within each of them that the liberating and enslaving forces confront one another. So if we are in a society of control, in some way or other, if we need to evaluate that society, we have to look at the way in which these liberating and enslaving forces confront one another within each of these technologies that I'm going to mention today. So control, then, unlike discipline, what Deleuze means by control is not the once-for-all shaping of habits and consciousness, not a single standard of the normal or the norm against which all are judged, not creation of a single individual, a disciplined subject, but a dividual with an array of distinct divisible elements. And control, unlike the modes of regulation in disciplinary apparatuses, control is constant, discontinuous. It's a constant evaluation and assessment of our capacities and conduct, dispersed across multiple switch points of exclusion, modulation, or exclusion. So we're talking in the present not about discipline, but about control, about modulation in a constant present oriented to the future. So let's try and look at a little bit of empirical evidence, if I may use that phrase with you colleagues here today. Beginning by talking about bodies. Well, if you're in the UK, you become increasingly familiar with the press reports of quite astounding and previously unthinkable developments in the life sciences. Womb transplant, the first womb transplant. The first face transplant, a full face transplant. A new drug developed to cut our dependence on drinking. You can still drink, but unfortunately it's not going to give you any pleasure whatsoever, so you might as well stick to your wonderful organic grape juice that you have here in Brazil. I've been trying. Here, Hayley Fraser has had a 3D printed hand, a new hand to replace her hand that she'd lost, printed on a 3D printer. Here is a reflection on a decade of the love drug, Viagra, transforming the sexual capacities of elderly males, or those who feel the need for it, and probably having as significant a consequence for the organization of male sexuality as the contraceptive pill had for female sexuality. And here is the announcement of Craig Venter's creation of synthetic life, Synthia, a bacteria from which he removed all the genetic material, and then he replaced it with genetic material which he himself had got fabricated by a so-called DNA foundry from the 4 sugar bases of deoxyribose nucleic acid. Genetics material created from inorganic sugar bases. Something is happening here. We don't know what. Perhaps, at least at some level, what's happening is that life is moving from mystery to mechanism. We're beginning to think of living creatures as in some way or other mechanical. Their properties can be anatomized at the molecular level. We can identify the functional properties of coding sequences, as Craig Venter did, and insert them into organisms to make them do the things that we want them to do. We can identify the functional properties of proteins and see how they work in relation to the way in which they fold and unfold. We can visualize psychiatric and other disorders at the molecular level in terms of ion channels, enzyme activities, transporter genes, membrane potentials. We've moved, to use the phrase from Ludwig Fleck, we've moved to a molecular style of thought. We no longer envisage life as we did on this side of the screen in terms of organs and systems of organs that we could visualize more or less by looking at them. We now envisage life at this molecular level. That's a protein folding. That is an ion channel on the membrane of a neuron. That is a little cartoon of how a synapse works. So here are a couple of my heroes or anti-heroes, the first of whom being Ian Wilmot. Ian Wilmot wrote, or had written for him, a biography, an autobiography. The title is rather a modest one. It was called The Second Creation, Dolly and the Age of Biological Control. As I mentioned earlier, some of us believe we know who was responsible for the first creation, but the second creation, that was Professor Wilmot. This is what he says. Until the birth of Dolly, scientists were apt to declare that this or that procedure would be biologically impossible, but now that expression seems to have lost all meaning. In the 21st century and beyond, human ambition will be bound only by the laws of physics, the rules of logic, and our descendants' own sense of right and wrong. Truly, Dolly has taken us into the era of biological control. And he goes on to say, this means that we can no longer assume that the biological itself will impose limits on human ambitions. As a result, humans must accept much greater responsibility towards the realm of the biological, which has, in a sense, become a wholly contingent condition. We can do what we want to do. Life is open to our own desires, limited only by the rules of logic and our own ethics and regulations that constrain what we can and cannot do. And this idea that we are now in the age of a second creation, where the creators are now not supernatural, but they are our life scientists, is also very much the way in which the work of Craig Venter in his creation of the first artificial organism, Cynthia, was also represented. And here indeed is Craig Venter playing God on the cover of Newsweek. So what are we to make of this? Of course, this is scientific hubris. It's pride. It's overclaiming. Much remains biologically impossible. And to just go off my slide text for a moment, the translator will allow me, I work with a wonderful neuroscientist, Jack Price, who works on stem cells, neural stem cells. And when he read this phrase in one of my presentations, he was outraged because he showed quite clearly that there is much that is biologically impossible. He works on brain repair in stroke, and although we can do much to rehabilitate people with stroke, there is much that remains biologically impossible. But the idea that we can do what we wish with living processes on the basis of this engineering model of life as mechanism, not mystery, is a mutation, I want to suggest, in our very idea of life. This molecular vision of life, this idea of bodies and brains as engineerable, seems to have put an end to vitalism. There is nothing specific about living creatures, about living organisms. In fact, although I'm not going to talk about this today, I think one can learn quite a bit from a wonderful essay by my favorite historical epistemologist, Georges Canguilhem, called Machine and Organism. Because I'm a neo-vitalist, and I think it is important to understand what it is about living creatures that's not engineerable. But I'm not going to talk about that today. So if we're in this age of, or this fantasy of biological control, these old divisions of the normal and the pathological no longer seem to be so salient. There's no normal lifespan. There's no normal reproduction. There's no normal aging. The distinctions that we used to have between the cure of a disorder, the normalization of a violation, the modulation of life, all those have blurred. Manipulation, optimization, these are the things which our life scientists offer for us. Normality itself, the very idea of what a normal human being is, a normal lifespan, a normal reproductive life, a normal aging, has been thrown into question. It seems that we are in an age of control over our biology. An age where we can think about our future, we can bring our future into the present, and we can shape our future by taking it into our own hands. An emergent form of life. Oh, something very strange has happened to my slides here, for which I apologize. Yeah, okay. They're still there, but in a rather bizarre way. Such is technology, which we can control, it seems, rather less than genomics. Are we then in an emergent form of life? What do I mean by an emergent form of life? A form of life, the rules and premises for conducting one's life, the regimes of authority underpinning those rules, the ways we understand ourselves, the ways we are understood by others, our very idea of what we hope for, what we fear, and what our obligations are towards others. That's what I mean by a form of life, and I want to suggest that that idea of our form of life is transforming as we are transforming as living beings. That's what I mean by an emergent form of life. Now, I don't think one great innovation has led to this emergent form of life. I still think there's a great deal to be gained by reading a wonderful book by Michel Foucault called Birth of the Clinic, where Foucault reflects on the emergence of the clinical gaze, a new way of thinking about, acting on, and intervening in the body at the beginning of the 19th century. And Foucault shows, I think, in a remarkably interesting way, how that clinical gaze emerged at the intersection of a whole range of different pathways, many of which were not at all connected with medicine. A new way of organizing security, so that if you wanted to get medical help as a pauper, you had to go into a hospital. The rise of the idea of a citizen with rights, which meant that the hospital had to start documenting your life, the new case histories that began to emerge in the hospitals, a new way of training doctors at the bedside, and so on and so on and so on. Many different pathways intersected to create this new emergent way of thinking about the body. And I think the same thing is true here. We have seen, as a result of multiple transformations, the beginning of an emergence of a new form of life. What I want to do for a moment then here is to focus on what that might mean in terms of what I have called biological citizenship, the expectations and the obligations of citizens. I apologize for the fact that my slides have gone a little crazy today, but I press on. Okay, so what do we mean by citizenship? When I talk about citizenship, I'm not talking about it specifically as a legal capacity, a status which is bestowed on some subjects by authorities, legal subjects, political subjects, social subjects, all these forms of external imposition of a status on individuals. I'm thinking more of citizenship as a mode of self-formation, a mode of self-understanding, a way in which individuals come to think of themselves as citizens of a certain country, subjects of a certain way of life, certain habits, certain beliefs, certain traditions, and organize themselves with relations of affiliation and differentiation to others. And I've argued, especially in that book, The Politics of Life Itself, which I'll talk about a little later on, that at least since the 18th century, at least in the countries that I've studied, these ideas of citizenship have become infused with ideas about the living, vital properties of those individuals who are citizens. The way in which citizens are understood by others, and the way in which citizens are understood by themselves are infused by ideas of their biology. We only have to think, for instance, of racial science in Europe in the 18th century, and the way in which the inhabitants of certain countries were considered as races that had certain inherent characteristics, moral, spiritual, intellectual, which united them and which divided them from others. The very idea of a subject of a certain country, of a certain region, became infused with biological conceptions of what those individuals were. And I think you can see that moving throughout those historical changes from the 18th century onwards. Some of you may be familiar with Paul Rabinow's idea of biosociality, which is his term for the way in which those groups themselves come to define themselves, their affiliations, their links to one another, their obligations, their rights and their responsibilities in terms of their biology. Sociality has become, and perhaps was for a couple of hundred years already, biological. So citizenship, since the 19th century at least in Europe, and I know less about your region here, has been linked to biological conceptions of the subject. And as I say, these have involved both relations of inclusion, who is part of our community, who are citizens like us, and relations of exclusion, who is not. And also, within those who are not citizens, views about who can be made into citizens, who are possible citizens, and who are impossible citizens who will forever have to be excluded and in certain circumstances eliminated. So citizenship is a relation of inclusion, it's also a relation of exclusion. As I've suggested, excuse me, biological citizenship since the 19th century, at least from the 19th century to the 20th century, has been linked to the developing discipline of biology. And we know across those periods that the most powerful way of thinking about citizenship in biological terms was in terms of race and blood and heredity. The inherited constitution determined your character. Character was both physical and moral, and the constitution of individuals and populations was territorialized, was spatially organized on the nation and on the race. In this sense, citizenship is not a philosophical conception, it's a governmental conception. It's linked to projects for making up citizens, and by making up citizens, making up the nation itself. And conceptions of citizenship were intrinsically linked to ways of governing the conduct of individuals and all. Now, I think... Oh, good. That actually happened. I think we've seen some intriguing transformations of citizenship, and I just want to explore some of those in the next few minutes. Perhaps the most common way of thinking of citizenship in relation to biology is the idea that citizens have certain biological rights. They have rights and duties in relation to health, and those rights are guaranteed by the state, and individuals can press a claim on their political authorities because of their status as sufferers. Now, we see this in countries that have a nationalized health service, but we saw it perhaps most explicitly argued in a wonderful book by Adriana Petrina called Life Exposed, which looked at the way in which disputes were emerging around life itself in the Ukraine after the meltdown of the nuclear reactor at Chernobyl. And Petrina, who was the first person to my knowledge to use the phrase biological citizenship, used it to characterize the way in which individuals in post-Chernobyl Ukraine Ukraine, which had just become a democratic society, used their suffering as a political resource, a way in which they could stake their claim for treatment on the state in post-Soviet Ukraine. They redefined their conditions as acute radiation sickness, and on the basis of their status as citizens, demanded recompense from the state. So this is a kind of passive demand that citizens make upon the state in the name of biological rights. And what I think we've seen, and what I've argued as many others have argued elsewhere, is that we have seen a transformation of these passive notions of rights to a kind of active citizenship of campaigning groups, in which campaigning groups organize around new forms of collectivization. They make new kinds of demands on the political apparatus. They have a new relationship to biomedical expertise. They train themselves in biological knowledge and in biomedical knowledge in order to make those active organizational demands for not just for their rights, but for specific forms of treatment that they themselves claim to understand on the basis of their acquisition of expertise and technologies. They become, as Rainer Rapp has phrased it, they become ethical pioneers. Those active citizenship groups, although they are perhaps only an exception, nonetheless demonstrate something about the forms of life that are emerging at this moment, because these are people who incorporate medical and biomedical expertise into their own understanding of themselves. They actively campaign on the basis of that knowledge for specific forms of treatment. They ally themselves with medicine and biomedicine in seeking better knowledge of their own condition, and they demand their own rights to control what happens to them in the form of their treatment. So this patient activism, which, as I say, is exceptional, however widespread it is, nonetheless shows to us the emergence of a new way in which individuals are beginning to relate to biomedical knowledge as a matter of their own self-understanding and a matter of their own management of their own life itself. So these were the kinds of groups which you could see if you looked at the internet a year or so ago. Some of them are really quite old. There are some groups here that simply reflect a long history of campaigning around particular kinds of conditions. Some of them are quite new in the way that they organize themselves. So the Alzheimer's Association, for instance, is one of these really old campaigning groups. Some of them are quite new in the way in which they organize themselves around very specific, biologically understood conditions. And some of them are, perhaps at first sight, a little bit surprising. For instance, at the bottom of the slide here, you'll see the Chicago Center for Jewish Genetic Diseases. The idea of a Jewish genetic disease, for those who know their history, sends a little shiver down your spine. But these are not campaigners for the elimination of these pathological individuals who are corrupting the gene pool of the race. These are self-organized organizations who have identified that amongst some lineages, some Jewish lineages, there is a very high probability of certain genetic diseases. Tay-Sachs disease is perhaps the most well understood, that that there's a high proportion of carriers of the Tay-Sachs mutation amongst Ashkenazi Jews in America. If a boy and a girl carrying that mutation marry and have children, there's a very high probability that their child will develop Tay-Sachs disease. So in the Chicago Center for Genetic Disorders and in many others, Jewish families are counseled on this. In another rather interesting, and going off my slide again, rather interesting development, the so-called Dor Yeshorim, children of the righteous, a Jewish rabbi in the United States who'd lost, I think, 4 or 5 of his children to Tay-Sachs disease, organized a very specific way of dealing with this, in which young men and young women would have their genetic profiles stored on a database. If a young man and a young woman were going out together, going steady, maybe thinking of forming a relationship and having kids, they would consult the database, and the database would look to see whether or not they were carriers of Tay-Sachs and would advise them, or probably their mothers, whether or not this was a good marriage to make. Okay, a kind of genetic politics which seeks, by active engagement of those individuals themselves, to eliminate the possibility of certain kinds of disorders being carried in that lineage. So we see these genetic knowledges being reincorporated into individual understandings and into collective understandings. One other manifestation of this, which many of you may be familiar with, is the rise of personal genomics. People spitting into a little tube and sending off their saliva to 23andMe, or to know me, or to decode me. Interestingly, all the me's, know me, personalize me, decode me, and getting back from those organizations information on their genetic risk profile. Now, actually, despite all the enormous fascination which there was about these new personalized genetics companies, in almost every circumstance, the genetic information which the individual gets back gives them no medically utilizable information whatsoever. But despite the fact that it doesn't give people information on which they can act, because it just shows them that their risk of developing a disorder is slightly above or slightly below the population level risk, it almost never tells you you have a high probability of developing a disorder. Despite the fact that the information has little medical relevance, you hear again and again the kind of statement that here is on the 23andMe website. I thought, how fascinating if I could know, in the yellow, if I could know more about my future. I should know. I should be aware for myself, for my children. If there's something that I could prevent for the future or live my life in a different way, why not learn? Why not help myself? Why not be knowledgeable in that information for my health and well-being? So there is some evidence, at least, that these forms of biological knowledge are reshaping individuals' ideas of their own life form, of their own form of life, of the way in which they could conduct themselves, and the way in which they should relate to others, especially in relation to their children. And of course, this raises some quite fundamental dilemmas. So if we move forward rapidly to the present, many of you, I'm sure, will have heard of Angelina Jolie and her decision to have a double mastectomy on the basis of a genetic test and a family history that showed to her that she had a very high probability of developing breast or ovarian cancer. This looks as if it's the paradigm case for someone who understands their life expectancies in terms of genetics. In fact, of course, it's highly unusual, because we know that although we know quite a lot about the heredity of breast cancer, we know that our capacity to predict your likelihood of developing breast cancer from genomic information in most cases is really rather hard. Most cases, actually, although we know an awful lot about the inheritance of breast cancer from family studies, we can only predict about 20% of the likelihood that an individual will develop breast cancer. 80% remains unexplained by everything we know about genetics, the so-called missing heredity. And you see this again and again and again in studies of the genomics of complex common disorders. So we are, in fact, rather far from this fantasy of complete knowledge and complete control. Nonetheless, one sees here in the dilemma faced by Angelina Jolie and the dilemma faced by so many others who find themselves in this situation, the question of how you make difficult and fatal choice, potentially fatal choices in this complex area of probabilities and possibilities about your life itself, where even not to know is a choice, and even not to choose is a choice. In a rather less fundamental way, should you take statins to reduce your chance of a heart attack or stroke? Some say you should, some say you shouldn't, some say the burden of the statin leading to possible side effects is too high and the possibility of getting stroke is too low. Should you get or not get your doctor to prescribe you statins? Should you get a very expensive life-extending drug like the drugs that are used for late-stage bowel cancer or late-stage kidney cancer that will cost about 60 or 70,000 pounds to extend, I don't know how many, about to 250,000 real to extend your life by 3 months? Should your health service provide you with those drugs? If your health service doesn't provide you with those drugs, then should you campaign to get those drugs, bearing in mind that every time you are prescribed those drugs, somebody else is denied the treatment, many others are denied the treatment that they might obtain for those funds. So these questions about how we should manage our individual and collective lives in the face of this new biological knowledge have become unavoidable, inextricably bound up with how we live our lives in the advanced liberal democracies of today. It's clear then that we've moved to a situation where we have no alternative but to take a kind of responsibility over our lives. And the power of doctors and medicine has moved far beyond that of health and illness, of cure, to the management of life itself. There are dreams, there are dreams of prediction and prevention. Perhaps the most powerful dreams in medicine today are those of being able to predict and intervene early on the basis of that prediction in order to prevent. But the reality is that we live in a world of profound uncertainty about the implications of this new genetic and biological knowledge for the lives that we as individuals are going to live. Yes, we're in a world of prediction and management of risks, whereas some at the beginning of the Human Genome Project anticipated a kind of fatalism in the face of our biology, that is to say, a knowledge of the future without any capacity to alter it. In fact, we see, as I've tried to illustrate, the emergence of new forms of responsibility and new forms of activism. And that's what I mean by contemporary biological citizenship. If there's one thing that we know about all these ways of thinking, it's that they're really infused with the question of the future. They're all about bringing your future into your present and trying to anticipate it, trying to manage it, trying to regulate it, and trying to bring about that which you want and avoid that which you fear. So the shadow of the future falls very heavily over the present. And almost all our rationalities of biopolitics are saturated with these anticipations of the future. They imagine the future in different ways. They seek to bring about some and avoid others. They try to bring the future into the present in a whole range of different ways. But overarching them all is this concern, perhaps a general regime of futurity. Ulrich Beck introduced us to the idea of risk society, the idea that we were in a society with the risk management of everything. But I think this regime of futurity takes us a little bit beyond the management of risk. preparedness, precaution, prevention, preclusion. These P's fundamentally shape the way in which we try to engage with the future. The future and management of the future becomes an obligation for all of us. There used to be a program on BBC television when I was young, sometime last century. It was about doctors. It was called Your Life in Their Hands. And these were the heroic doctors who were coming to save you when you had a heart attack or you were run over by a car or something like this. Cover of Nature a few months ago, Your Life in Your Hands. Not your life in their hands, but your life in your hands. So I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, in whose hands is your life these days? Who has made things possible for us? Who has made things obligatory for us? Who has expanded our responsibilities to such an extent that even to say no, even to refuse amniocentesis if you're a pregnant woman, even to refuse a genetic test, even to say, I don't want to know, is a choice for which you can bear responsibility. And as it happens, you can bear legal responsibility, because if your child is born with a disorder and you have chosen not to take a test, then it's possible, at least in some regimes, for that child to sue its parents and to sue the doctors for wrongful birth or wrongful life. Okay, let's move quickly to souls. See if my slides will work a little bit better on this half. It was Joseph Stalin who first used the term, as far as I know, engineers of the human soul. And he used it to describe the poets of the Soviet regime. They were engineers of the human soul. Our priests and our poets were engineers of the human soul. But in the 20th century, as I've argued elsewhere, psychologists became, in a crucial way, engineers of the human soul. They understood us better than we understood ourselves, and they were the ones who organized our ways of thinking about and managing our souls and our souls of our children. But today, the truths about ourselves are spoken not so much in the language of psychology, but in the language of biology and biomedicine. It's not just that bodies have become mechanism, but minds themselves have become mechanism. And if the mind, like the body, is in this regime of engineering in the service of human hopes and desires, well, what then? Are our neuroscientists now the engineers of our souls, and with what consequences? So in my earlier work, in these 3 books I put up on the slide here, I tried to trace the emergence of this psychological complex across the 20th century, in which cells had become inhabited by this deep interior psychological space, the space of the psyche or the space of the mind. And it was in this space of the psyche or the mind that culture, that biography, that your life experiences were inscribed. That was the space of your personality, and that was the space that was charted out by all the disciplines that had that prefix of psi: intelligence, personality, trauma, repression, the unconscious, the inferiority complex, inhibition, extroversion, love, blah, 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 blah. They all inhered in this internal psychological space. And unlike conventional ideas of professions, where professions try to keep their knowledge to themselves, the psi was really generous. Everybody could talk the language of psi. Teachers, social workers, probation officers, prison officers, etc., 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 learned to speak like little psychologists. And I argued in this work that the emergence of this psi made a certain way of governing possible. It made it possible to govern persons in ways that seemed legitimate because they were based on objective knowledge. Now, towards the end of the 20th century, you began to see speculations like this emerging from neuroscientists. Francis Crick and his astonishing hypothesis. You are, he said, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, your ambitions, your sense of personal identity are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll's Alice might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. And Patricia Churchland, in her neurophilosophy, bit by experimental bit, she says, neuroscience is morphing our conception of what we are. The weight of evidence now implies that it's the brain, rather than some non-physical stuff, that feels, thinks, and decides. When these kinds of speculations in the later decades of the 20th century were made, they seemed rather exceptional, because neuroscience was, after all, a work of the laboratory. As I said right at the beginning, Francis O. Schmidt, invented the term neuroscience in 1962. And from 1962 to about the 1990s, for 30 years, neuroscience was a work of the laboratory. But at the end of the 20th century, something happened. And that something was the emergence of neuroscience very rapidly from the laboratory into the world itself. Not just in psychiatry, not just in social neuroscience, but in a whole series of areas, in law, in policy, in warfare, in economics, in marketing, in education. It seemed as if, or it was claimed that, neuroscience had something to say about how we should manage our daily life. Not just speculation, you're nothing but a bunch of neurons, but practical engagement in how we should manage our daily affairs in the light of this new knowledge of the brain. And you began to see dozens, if not hundreds, of books like this, all arguing that it is neuroscience, not psychological science, that should inform us about how we should manage our lives. Now, in my book, Neuro, that I wrote with Joël Abirached, which was published in the UK in 2013, we tried to account for the way in which neuroscience had moved so rapidly out from the lab and into the world. And to make a long story very short, we argued that there were three pathways along which neuroscience had moved out into the world: a neuromolecular gaze, a visible mind, and a plastic brain. And I just want very briefly to sketch these out, because you'll see, I think, that in each of them, a certain way of thinking about the brain is intrinsically linked to a certain way of intervening on the brain. The neuromolecular gaze, first of all. Well, I think what I've said already probably is enough to indicate to you that in this new way of thinking about the brain is thought of as an organ, just like any other organ. It is not mystery, it is mechanism. It can be broken down into nerve cells, synapses, receptor sites, ion channels, and so on. You can draw cartoons of how it works like that. You can imagine normal variations in perception, in cognition, in emotion, at this molecular level. You can imagine, or begin to imagine, mental disorders and pathologies as anomalies in these molecular systems, and you can dream at least of the manipulation of the brain at this molecular level. Of course, these developments in the understanding of the brain are profoundly reductionist. And I don't say that in a critical way, because the way in which these understandings of the molecular mechanisms of the components of the brain have been understood have been by sort of classical experimental design. Reduce everything to the most simple possible. Find the most simple model animal. Dissect out an individual nerve cell and explore it in vitro. Try and reduce everything to the simplest possible structure, and then think how you will build up from that structure to the complex. That is actually the rationale of the Human Brain Project that I mentioned earlier on, a very bottom-up driven project in which you characterize the morphology, the properties of every individual cell in every region of the brain. You try and model the way in which you can put those together, and you hope that out of this molecular level, and understanding at this molecular level, that the more complex circuits that we know happen in the brain will emerge. This was always the hope of reductionism. You would move, once you understood the basic elements, then you could build up from these elements to the complexities of more of organs and then of organisms. Of course, this conceptually and practically proved incredibly, and has proved incredibly difficult. But that didn't stop this model, this molecular model of the brain, very rapidly becoming the basis of all sorts of interventions. And this was the first and perhaps the most powerful way in which neuroscience began to move out of the lab, actually very early through this what I've called psychopharmacological imaginary. The imagination that if you could identify things at this molecular level, you could intervene on them at this molecular level, and you could change emotion, experience, conduct, and intervene in disorders like depression and anxiety. This little cartoon here that I hope is reeling away on the slide here. This is actually taken from the website of Eli Lilly, trying to demonstrate to you how the drug Prozac, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, worked in order to mitigate depression. It was based on a particular hypothesis that depression was related to too little serotonin in the synapses of certain nerves. And Prozac worked to increase the amount of serotonin in that synaptic cleft. There. You can't actually see it very clearly, and my slides have gone a bit doolally. I much apologize for that. We have seen a huge increase in the uptake of these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors and a whole group of other drugs based upon this hypothesis. And yet the paradoxical thing is that despite the huge uptake of these drugs, almost no one believes that this is the way in which the drugs work. No one believes that the drugs work, if they do, in brackets, if they do, no one believes that the drugs work in this way. But nonetheless, this belief, this imaginary of precisely targeting a drug upon a neuromolecular mechanism, modulating the brain at the molecular level and thus modulating conduct, has become absolutely fundamental to shaping our way of life. That's the first pathway. Second pathway, visibility. The brain was very difficult to visualize because of the skull. And without going into the history here, there's a long history of attempts to understand what was going on in the brain. First of all, by dissecting the brain out when individuals had died, trying to identify which parts of the brain were responsible for which functions. Later, by trying to inject some kinds of dyes into the brain. And more recently, as you'll be familiar, with these wonderful scanning techniques. These scanning techniques like CT scanning and MRI scanning. CT scanning and MRI scanning initially began as ways of visualizing tissues in the brain, the structure of the brain. Something rather strange happened when the very same technologies looked as if they were being used to produce the very same kinds of images, not of the structure of the brain, but of the functions of the brain. fMRI, perhaps the most common visualization technique, tries and claims to visualize functions in the brain by showing the areas in the brain where oxygenated blood is taken up. Oxygenated blood is taken up in certain areas of the brain. The fMRI machine can show the areas where blood oxygenation and blood deoxygenation occurs. This technology, which appeared to show the living brain in the living individual, became enormously popular in the first 30 years since it was developed. In the first 30 years since the invention of this functional MRI technology, 53,662 papers on relating brain activities to responses to art, responses to painting, to composers, to performers, to authors, to television commercials, how the brain was activated in grief over loss of a child, hundreds of studies purporting to image love, hate, fear, and acts of choice. It appeared as if the vision of the scientists could walk amongst the mind itself. And very rapidly, oh, that's the wrong thing, very rapidly you began to see arguments like this. Biological basis of mental disorder is now demonstrable. No one can watch the frenzied, localized activity in the brain of a person driven by obsession or the dull glow of a depressed brain and still doubt that these are physical conditions rather than some ineffable sickness of the soul. And we pretty rapidly began to get arguments which claimed that these brain scans could predict the pathway of depression, that they could read people's intentions, that they could study the brain effects of rejection, and that they could look at, quote, the neural correlates of maternal and romantic love, to show you that different parts of the brain were activated in maternal love that were activated in romantic love. This visual imaginary is just as an imaginary as the pharmaceutical imaginary. It depends upon a hypothesis, which I think is really hard to defend these days, that brain functions are localized and that you can identify the specific locales where a particular brain function is based. But this, as I say, is an imaginary, because the same brain regions are activated by many different tasks. It also assumes that what you're seeing indicates something about the activity of neurons. But there's a problem here of scale, because there are something like 10 to the 10 neurons and 10 to the 14, that's huge numbers of synaptic connections in the human cortex alone. And in each little voxel, each of the little cells that are imaged in a brain scan like this, there are about 1 billion synapses in 1 cubic millimeter. That's the smallest that you can see in these contemporary brain images. But more than that, we have no idea at what scale it makes sense to look at the brain. As one of the neuroscientists, a brain imager, remarked when we were doing this work for Neuro, it makes no sense to read a newspaper with a microscope. It makes no sense to read a book from a photograph of the bookshelf. We don't know at what scale we should begin to look at the brain, and we don't really know whether this proxy, blood oxygenation, is a good way of looking at it. The dull glow of the depressed brain we saw in one of those arguments. Well, which of these brains imaged here shows the dull glow of a depressed brain? In fact, all these are absolutely the same brain image, merely coloured up in different ways by those who are reporting it. The colouring of the brain, the way in which the brain is presented to you in those images that we are so familiar with, is itself an artifact which uses conventions about what red and blue and yellow might mean, cultural conventions, to indicate to you that you are seeing something like activity, high activity, or low activity, high activity red, low activity blue. Again, an imaginary. And recently, many brain images have become very critical, brain images themselves, very critical of the way in which these images are used and the ways in which they are interpreted. I've just put on the slide here two rather controversial pieces. One which showed that you could actually, by using the same technology, show brain activity in a dead salmon, and the other which showed that many of the mathematical technologies that were used in order to show these links were in fact highly spurious. I'm going to move very rapidly through my third and last and then come to something like a conclusion. So that's the second pathway. The third pathway is this idea that the brain is plastic, that the human brain can be shaped by experience. Now, of course, we have known for many years that synapses are plastic. They're changed by experience. What is memory? Memory is the changing of your synaptic pathways by experience. As Donald Hebb, who I put on the slide here, says, what fires together, wires together. But over the last 20 or 30 years, this idea of plasticity has moved from the synapses, the junctions between nerves, to the very structure of the brain itself. Work on brain repair after stroke, and some very controversial work with animals who were given artificial brain lesions or who were constrained in various ways, has demonstrated that the brain can, quote, rewire itself as a result of exercise. Areas that are ablated, that are damaged through stroke, can be replaced by regimes, very carefully constructed regimes of exercise. The brain can rewire itself, as has now been said. This is, by the way, on the slide here. That is Paul Bakirita, who was one of the founders, terrific founder of rehabilitation therapy, people with stroke. That's a little picture of the Silver Spring monkeys, very controversial case. These monkeys that were constrained and lesioned in various ways to explore brain plasticity. That was the first court case in the United States brought by PETA, the anti-vivisection organization. That bit of research was done by Edward Taub here, who later became very respectable and invented his own technique for brain rehabilitation. The third area that's been absolutely crucial is the idea of epigenetics. That's the idea that in the brain, the expression of genes is shaped itself by experience. The experience that an individual has, a baby has, from the moment of conception and probably even before, shapes the way in which the thousands of genes that are involved in brain function express themselves, and possibly changes the brain irreversibly as a result of the kinds of experience and input that the developing organism has from the moment of conception onwards. That on the board in that corner here is Michael Meany. He did these wonderful experiments with guinea pigs and rats, showing that the way in which the baby pup's brain developed was highly dependent on the way in which the mother related to that pup in its early years. And here on the bottom of the screen here is Elizabeth Gould, who showed in some very elegant work that new neurons could be formed in the human brain right up through adulthood, which we had not known before because we thought that all the neurons were formed in the human brain very early on, and after that it was all downhill all the way from every glass of wine or every cigarette that you smoked. So very rapidly here we get the idea of the brain itself as an open dynamic system changed and changeable by its milieu. This idea of plasticity, of the capacity to rewire the brain through calculated interventions, has become a crucial element, certainly in UK, in social policies towards deprived children and families, arguing that the effects of deprivation are no longer written in the psyche, they are written in the brain itself. And of course, if you go on the web, you can discover that you can rewire your brain for love, or you can harness neuroscience for your own personal growth, etc. In other words, we've moved into an era where we can potentially govern ourselves by acting upon our brains. We can understand deprivation in terms of the effect of a limited experience, an unstimulating environment upon the brain itself. We can build resilience in our children by acting upon the brain itself. We can transform our education system by acting upon the brain itself. Sometimes these arguments are incredibly naive. Gosh, education changes the brain. Who would have thought it? Gosh, the brain underpins certain types of behavior. Who would have thought it? Now, some suggested that the result of these brain-based explanations would be highly reductionist, would indicate to people that they had no control over their brain in the way in which they hoped to have control over their psyche. But actually that has proved not to be the case. The wonderful anthropologist Emily Martin, whose work I admire enormously, was very, very critical of these forms of neuroreductionism because she felt they left no space for culture, for action, for agency to act upon the brain. But like it or not, as we see here, we've seen a multitude of new technologies for taking care of your brain, managing your brain, improving your brain, understanding your feelings in terms of your brain, taking care of your brain, managing your own subjectivity. Actually, down here, I don't have any chance to talk about this, but this you can buy on the web here. This is a transcranial magnetic stimulator that you can buy on the internet in order to stimulate various areas of your brain yourself. So we haven't moved into an age where humans are puppets of their brain. We've moved into an age where humans have brains and humans have the responsibility for managing their brains in the same way as they acquired responsibility for managing their bodies. Oh, I'm going the wrong way here. Okay, let me sum up because I'm way over my time. I've argued elsewhere that what we have seen here in all these developments that I've tried to illustrate is the emergence of what you might call a new pastorate of biomedical experts who become the sources of the language and the judgment we use to understand ourselves. They are the people who we trust, who give us the advice as to how we should manage our lives, and they are reshaping our very ideas of what we can do, what we can hope for, and what we can expect. Kant's questions, what can I know, what must I do, what may I hope, are now being posed in these somatic terms. Somatic material is what we act upon. Somatic experts articulate our rules for living. We understand at least partly ourselves in these biomedical terms. We reshape our expectations in these languages. And we do this not only in relation to our bodies, but also in relation to our souls. We have seen, added to all those experts that we were already familiar with, a new set of experts in managing our souls ourselves. So bioscience is transforming what it is to be human. bodies and souls are amenable to engineering, at least in prospect, in the service of our own desires. It's not simply a matter of biological reductionism. It seems to have opened up multiple biological possibilities. It's not just a matter of normalization, because no one is normal. It's not really a matter of choosing between cure, therapy, or enhancement, but of modulating our capacities. So the question is, to what extent is our life in our own hands? I think what we see is this argument about control that I mentioned right at the very beginning perhaps comes closest to capturing where we are in this world of modulating bodies and souls in relation to the logics of everyday existence. But the question that is open to us is how we should relate to this new complex of truth and power that's reshaping our very sense of ourselves. This age of biological control where nothing seems biologically impossible. Whether it's a dream or whether it's a reality, it's a radical challenge to humanism, a blow to narcissism. So just two little slides to end with. My work tries to be informed by the kind of approach that Michel Foucault took, in particular his work on historical ontology. This is historical ontology in the words of Foucault. Criticism is no longer practiced in the search for formal structures, but as a historical investigation into the events that have led us to constitute ourselves and recognize ourselves as subjects of what we are doing, thinking, and saying. A series of questions. How are we constituted as subjects of our own knowledge? How are we constituted as subjects who exercise or submit to power relations? How are we constituted as moral subjects of our own action? And he goes on to say that these are both specific, in that they always bear on specific material, specific time, a body of determinate practices, but again and again they concentrate on the problems of relations between sanity and insanity, sickness and health, crime and the law, sexual relations, and so on. And I think we'll see that all these examples that I've given, in a sense, confirm the way in which Foucault has explored these questions. I'm struck by the fact that something that Sigmund Freud said about our narcissism now also comes into question. In this famous quote, Foucault argues that the naive self-love of a human has been subject to blows at the hands of science when they learned the earth wasn't the center of the universe, when evolution destroyed the view that they had a privileged position in creation. But he says human megalomania will have suffered its third and most wounding blow from the research of the present time that seeks to prove to the ego that it's not even master in its own house, but must content itself with scanty information of what's going on unconsciously. And whereas he says that it's the psychoanalysts who uttered that call, perhaps I think it's the life scientists, and in particular the neuroscientists, who are placing in question our very idea of what it is to be human and our very idea of our privileged place in creation. And I'm just going to leave you, as I stop now for having gone on far too long, with this famous quote from Michel Foucault, suggesting that a new figure of the human is on the horizon. We know that Foucault didn't think the life sciences were those that were transforming these arrangements that had given such privilege to man, but I suggest that perhaps it is indeed the life sciences and neuroscience that are fundamentally transforming the privilege that we give to the human being in our ways of understanding, in our ethics, and in the ways in which we organize our relation to the rest of the world in which we live. With apologies for going on for so long, thank you for your attention.